On December 4th of 2017, a new round of wildfires hit Central California, which included the now infamous Thomas Fire. This has been by far the most destructive fire scene in California's recorded history. And, you know, Brad, you live in California, as you mentioned, and you recently went to some of the areas most affected by the fires, and you took some really interesting photos. And I want to kind of give you the floor to kind of talk about them and talk about some of the bizarre nature of the destruction that you saw, that how, you know, a lot of people are talking about how it doesn't match up to what a normal forest fire would how it would, you know, go. So could you kind of speak to that?
Yeah, sure. And you see right behind me a map of California and all the geothermal features. Well, it was a warm day. It was right when we were having Hardly Strictly Bluegrass. And one of my best friends who lives in Santa Rosa came down and stayed with me a couple nights, and we went to the shows. And that night he drove back. And when I woke up in the morning, I got a cryptic message from him that we're running for our lives. We're leaving our house. He was out of his house for about 2 weeks because of the smoke. Fires came within 1,500 yards of his house. So right away, people were saying that there were these blue lights. People were seeing them on the highway, like a blue mist, and as well as laser beams. And in fact, there are videos of blue laser beams coming down and creating mayhem, more fires, intensifying the fires. So seeing that I live up here and I was going to his house on Christmas Eve for a Christmas party just a week and a half ago, I left a little early with a couple buddies of mine, and we went to 3 different locations in Santa Rosa to see some of these burn sites. And I was actually very surprised that many of them are still there. I mean, all the stuff is right out there. And it was quite amazing to see some of the evidence that's still there, including round burn holes on the grass and the pavement. And then get this. So what it happens is these DEWs, directed energy weapons, are highly powerful laser beams that heat up, that will heat up a location, not necessarily burn it, but there were so many sparks and embers in the air, it would be easy enough for those fires to catch on. So these round hole, and I told my buddies when we're driving up there, let's look for 3 things, and we found them all. Look for the molten aluminum and chrome, and we have that. I'll show you an example here in a second. I just got to go grab it. We found the round holes, and get this, we found it at this fence line where on one side there was nothing burned. On the other side, just the bottom of the fence poles were burned about 1 foot off the ground, like totally toasted on the ground, and then above it we're fine. So it was this extreme heat that moved over. It caught an ember, which burned back to catch the post, or perhaps that was the beam coming out, and then they left it there for a second and it went away. And then the third thing was look for warped steel, okay? And this is kind of like 9/11. When you have extreme heat, and what it's been compared to, and I'd like to get Ryan's take on this because we both talk about Dr. Judy Wood, Where Did the Towers Go?, using directed energy weapons. And it basically just annihilates everything. And I have pictures of warped and bent steel frame girders in trailer homes. You know, trailer homes are mostly made out of metal, but they were just burned to the ground, toast, gone with warped metal, and oozing piles of aluminum coming from cars and stuff. And there were even reports of some of the beams going straight through the hood of a car and even through the block of a motor. So what we're talking about is extreme localized heat sources where we're right across the way, right across the street, sometimes even just a few feet away, trees, untouched, unburned, had the needles on them. So it was the most selective forest fire on planet Earth, that it would just get rid of mostly trailer homes in Santa Rosa, and then many exclusive homes up in the mountains where there is known to be an underground base between Napa and Sonoma County, as well as, and I was trying to talk to Project Camelot, see if she wanted to do a show on this, that there's also a reported Men in Black underground base up by Cloverdale, and that town got burned up too. But keep in mind, there are 16 locations that caught fire that night. The number's actually up closer to 60. Some of them just get grouped together in the Tubbs fire, but it's really like 20 locations, and they just go like right along a streak. This one we saw, it was a gun shop. They burned out the gun shop. On 3 sides were commercial real estate untouched. And then they got a line of trailer homes. The fire had no beginning and no end, but it just decimated everything in between. So this fire is very peculiar. And by the way, CAL FIRE, who is responsible for determining the cause of these fires, still has no cause. None at all. Nobody knows how they started, all across the state.
Do you think it has anything to do with like the port of Tianjin in China in 2015? Do you think that has anything to do with it? Because that they said that there were laser beams with that as well. So
yeah, that's a good one. You know, and right after the blue lights of California, I was on with Jimmy Church, and we were talking about because I witnessed it, and he wanted to hear what I had to say, and I happened to bring up that Tianjin, China, and I've been to Tianjin, China, and that huge explosion that happened. Although I don't think that's directed energy weapon. I have in my book, Future Esoteric, that was what they call the hammer of Thor, which are these titanium rods that just drop out from low orbiting satellites. And they fall with such incredible speed that when they hit, they have the explosive power of a nuclear bomb, but leave absolutely no trace, no residue of anything like a nuclear explosion or anything else.
That was disclosed a few, I don't know, 5-6 years ago. That was a program that was actually disclosed by the U.S. federal government. Yeah,
we know they have them. And by the way, there are no coincidences, guys. What happened right before that Tianjin explosion? China devalued the yuan a week before, totally pissed off the U.S. So they did something like this to teach them a lesson.
Brad, we will have a lot of your pictures going, as you know, when we edit the video afterwards. Ryan, yeah. I wanted to ask you who's to gain from something like this kind of geo-engineering. You know, if this is really the case, who really gains from burning down California?
There are probably a lot of ways that I could answer that question. I think I will take a equilibrated approach and suggest that I don't really have an answer, but my suggestion would be that maybe it's not necessarily somebody gaining, that it could just simply be a test, sort of like the so-called UFO we saw in California. It doesn't necessarily have to be an alien spacecraft. It doesn't have to be a military craft. It just is until we can identify it. And the fire can just be something that is until we can identify the purpose. And perhaps like that UFO, it was simply a military test. It was a weapons test. And I think that what Brad had suggested, because the last time I went and saw Brad, we talked about Judy Wood. We talked about where did the towers go. I actually have a copy of her book here right in front of me. I was just looking through it the other night. I read the entire thing front to back. And when you read it and you see the evidence that she presents, I've actually interviewed her once. You see the evidence that she presents. It's not leading. It's not insinuating. It's just evidence, what's been presented in the mainstream. And then you take that evidence, like I said about those files in NASA, the photographs from NASA and JPL, it's not something that anybody has to disclose, or we have to go get information from some secret archive or a Freedom of Information Act request. It's already available to the public. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, we have a pretty good idea of what happened on 9/11. And by researching and understanding that from evidence that exists, not something we have to go really dig up, from evidence that exists and it's available to our fingertips, if you will, on the internet, you take that information and you can apply that to something like the fires and see that, one, the technology no doubt exists. There are scientists who experiment with, it's called the Tesla-Hutchison effect, or the Hutchison effect, which causes the fusion of dissimilar materials, the levitation of heavy objects, the anomalous melting of materials, which is what Brad just said. While other materials next to it, all of a sudden they just you have an extreme heat that burns something, and right next to that you could have paper, or you could have a tree, and it's not even touched. And there's another significant thing I think about the fires that's interesting, because when you say extreme heat, when I interviewed Judy Wood, she stayed away from the usage of the word heat or vaporization, because she specifically told me, she said vaporization implies heat. And although there's heat and things are burning, it's also cold, because a lot of the firefighters and the people that were there, a lot of the people that were just working in the building, when that cloud of smoke, material, whatever it was, came down, people said it wasn't hot. It was very cold. And inside of it, it was like a tornado where things were lifted and levitated. Now, outside of that, outside of actual ground zero, which I would presume perhaps we could find the same thing with the fires outside of ground zero, there was a woman, I actually have her name here, Renee O'Carroll. She was an EMT. She was on the Brooklyn Bridge, which is over a mile from ground zero. And although at ground zero, things were very intensely cold, about a mile plus away, where there were cars actually exploding and metal was burning, but the plastic was not burning, a mile away from ground zero. Never reported by the mainstream media, never touched by the 9/11 Commission. This woman, and there were multiple reports of this, she's driving over the bridge in the ambulance coming downtown, and she said all of a sudden she felt this intense heat, like a microwave. And her reaction was basically what the police forces in the United States have used the microwave weapons for. You project them on a crowd to disperse the crowd. People want to rip their clothes off. And what did you see with people in the World Trade Center ripping their clothes off and jumping out the window, even though on some of those floors, no fire? There's even transcript of that with firefighters. They're asking the woman, what can you see? You know, she's like, it's an intense heat, but there's no fire, just smoke. There's no fire, it's just smoke. It's a microwave. So we're dealing with a whole bunch of different forms of technology here. And I think that whatever was responsible, as Brad said, for the Twin Towers and for other buildings, it wasn't just those two towers and Building 7, other buildings as well. We'll also see that with which I, again, would suggest is probably some type of weapons test more than anything. Although, you know, that could just be a part of it, and it could also mean something else.
You know, could it be, as we were talking about with the explosion in China, some sort of show of force? It seems like there's some sort of war going on behind closed doors, in a sense, or at least behind the view of the public. Could this be, like you said, just that? Well, look what we have. Don't push us too far, or if you back us into a corner, look what we got.
I'm sure that's a part of it. What about the food? How about a food company that knowingly puts something that is toxic and dangerous into the food supply? And they're not necessarily doing that because they want to kill people or harm people. They're doing it because, hey, they can make some money by saving some money on production. And then we'll just see what happens to the general public. Even though our scientists said this is poisonous, we'll just see what happens to the public. They're doing live experiments on the general population. Again, that's what I would think, that maybe this is, again, a live experiment with that type of theory. But then again, maybe Brad would be to answer it if it was something more than that.
Yeah, and Brad, show us what you got.
Add to that. All right, here's a little show and tell, guys. Look at that.
Is that fused with a similar material?
Aluminum.
There you go.
Molten aluminum and chrome. This is given to me by a friend of mine in Santa Rosa who got it from a place where he could take it. And he wanted me to show it around to say, look, this is aluminum, which burns. It gets to a melting point at 1,220 degrees. Whereas a house fire burns at its hottest point at 1,100 degrees. So we have an over 100 degree discrepancy. Okay, and then iron bends and warps at an even higher degree. So what we're talking about is really a matter of heat, as Ryan said, which could be very localized in some places, but then 12 feet away, a pine tree still has its green needles on. It didn't even burn. Okay, and I have pictures of that. I'll share them with you guys, as well as these round areas. So what I think was really going on in Northern California, and I think Ryan's on a good tip here, is they're showing a show of force. They're maybe also teaching a lesson to someone. Perhaps there's someone who lives in the Santa Rosa area that wants to get rid of all the trailer parks and make it all like an exclusive area. But I think this is the most telling one of all. This friend of mine who I went to visit on Christmas Eve knows some people who are big scale pot dealers, and some of them are pot growers. Some of them have great big spreads up on bald mountains in California. And that night of the fires, October 7th and 8th, they woke up the next morning. Not only was their house burned down, their greenhouse gone, their garage, storage shed, but the trees were still standing around them. So it's the most selective forest fire in history. And get this, most of those people are not allowed to go back or rebuild. They are now claiming the land. So this is Agenda 21 in action, you guys.
Yep.
This is how they're starting to claim land. And if they got to burn people out and kill a few people, well, that's just collateral damage. So I think that's what this is probably really all about. And they wait until the conditions are exactly right, just like they did in Southern California. I haven't seen any videos of lasers there, but how they started and how they continued to flare up is somewhat suspicious that maybe direct energy weapons were used down there as well.
Yeah, and not only directed energy weapons, but maybe something that's a subcategory of that. When you look at the so-called, and I'll say so-called because I'm not sure I am using the right word, so-called natural hurricanes, Hurricane Harvey and Irma, the one that parked, literally the media said parked over Houston and dumped trillions of gallons of water on Houston and then just moved away. You know, there was a hurricane right outside of New York the morning of September 11th. And right when it intensified to its strongest, or the strongest intensity that it was recorded, was almost the moment that the first plane struck the first tower. And then the second plane hit, and then this hurricane started to move away. Not a single news agency reported that there was a hurricane off the coast of New York that morning. So I mean, that was a natural event, but natural events can also be exploited. What I was going to say about hurricanes is that weather weaponry is very old. Kennedy talked about it at the United Nations back in the early 60s, late 50s. This is something that's been around for a long time. The Department of Defense has used weather weaponry. It's in their news transcripts that are available to the public. So if they've got weather weaponry, I mean, there are even Discovery Channel shows I watched as a kid where they're saying things like, well, if you take a ring and you place the ring on a table and the ring is the hurricane, and you take your finger, a finger is the laser, and you put the laser in the middle of the hurricane, you can just heat up the water and you can move it with a satellite anywhere you want on the planet. I mean, it's a very basic and simple concept. Weather weaponry has been around a long, long time. Now you intensify and amplify that with the fact that they've got, again, for lack of a better word, perhaps, directed energy weapons. And the possibilities are limitless because you always have plausible deniability. It was just a fire. That's just a hurricane. Yeah. And then you can do whatever you want. You can test weapons. You can use it to prove a point. Or I think, Brett, that's another great point you brought up, the fact that this is partly Agenda 21 or what they now call Agenda 2030. And I think the droughts in California were a part of that as well.
Yeah, Lyndon B. Johnson, even Lyndon B. Johnson said, if you can control the weather, you control the world. And
you know,
he who controls the weather will control the world.
Brad, one of the main points that'll that doubters of geoengineering will bring up is, why would the elites want to destroy the planet that they live on themselves? You know, and then what would you say to that?
Well, the elite may have a way out. They may be unaffected. They may have an antidote. The same thing goes with, why would they poison themselves with GMOs or vaccines or risk getting AIDS or something? Perhaps they have the antidote already. In the case of geoengineering, what we're talking about is weather modification and creating an atmosphere which is conductive. Now, the reason why your newscaster will lie to you after a chemtrail day and say that there are high wispy clouds in the air, even when you see the streaks of line above them, and that just happened to us in California the other day. Should have taken a picture. It was so funny. They're creating this ridge of high pressure where nothing can get around it. And we just got through one of the driest Decembers in recorded history in California here. So they can do what they want. And in this case, right now, I think they're pushing this cold mass into the central part of the country. And that's why I think we may be in store for something big here in the next few days or weeks, because when it's this cold and when the whole country, most of it is covered in snow, it's even going to snow in Florida tonight. It's like the nation is crippled. And if it's a tool for the deep state and they've used it, and there's a gag order against pilots or weathermen or anybody talking about it, they can keep it out of the purview of the public. And they've done very good job at that. And that's why, even though Congress has even started taking up the debate about geoengineering, and there's ample evidence and patents and all kinds of anecdotal evidence that we've been sprayed our skies for decades. And in fact, I was friends with Jerry Smith, who wrote the book Weather Warfare. He went up to do an episode of Conspiracy Theory with Jesse Ventura. He was dead a few weeks later.
Wow.
They got to him that night in the bar. He came home with this terrible cold, never recovered, and died. So this was a few years ago. Now I think it's not quite as dangerous, but he was on the cusp, and he wrote the book called Weather Warfare, and that's what this is all about. And that's why China sprays, and that's why Russia sprays. But I have an expat friend who lives in Cambodia now and knows exactly what chemtrails look like. He says he has never, ever seen a single chemtrail in Cambodia in the 5 years he's lived there. So some countries do, some don't.
Do you think, Brad, that the movie Geo-Storm is kind of the cabal's way of kind of hinting at what's going on behind closed doors? Because, they say they have to, give us breadcrumbs as to what really is going on. So do you think that movie is kind of their little wink, wink, nod, nod?
Thanks to a system of satellites, natural disasters have become a thing of the past. We can control our weather.
Right. Yeah. Hidden in plain sight kind of thing, Richie?
Yep.
Yeah. Or what Clint was alluding to, it's maybe just to say, hey, back off. We can do this to you, and nobody's going to report on it, and we can hit you real hard. And there's a storm, very cold storm right now going up the East Coast, and it's going to hit New York City in 2 days. So I'm predicting by the end of this week, we're in for some shocking news. Something real big is going to happen, like a fake EMP attack. Maybe it's going to go down with North Korea. Maybe some kind of, who knows? Maybe this is the time we get the fake alien attack. They seem to have set up the dominoes in such a way that it's ready to play that card out. But let's face it, the deep state has their back against the wall. And this may be the first time in history this has ever happened. So maybe they are doing a little show of force to try to get people, Trump or whatever, his team, to back off. Say, hey, look, we can hold your country hostage. We can steer these hurricanes into Houston. We can cut off the rain in California. Look, this time last year, we already had about 15 feet of snow up in Tahoe. I haven't used my ski pass once this year because there's no snow up there. So they can do this, and people need to be aware.